All right, guys, Thanksgiving week is always chaos. A bunch of early games, injuries stacking up, and a shorter runway to make decisions. So I wanted to give you my green light, yellow light, and red light plays early this week. This slate is actually full of matchups you can take advantage of, but there are also a few traps that can really burn you if you're not paying attention. So let's go through each position, quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends to see who you can trust, who you need to treat carefully, and who you should flat out avoid going into the holiday weekend. Let's start with green light quarterbacks. I'm going to start with Lamar Jackson. I totally get it. He doesn't look like himself. He's not taking off for scrambles. He's just not the same Lamar we've been used to. Two brutal fantasy performances in a row, both outside the top 24 fantasy quarterbacks, three straight performances outside the top 15, but we're talking about going up against the Bengals defense at home. He has two tight ends in Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, who can tear up this defense, who cannot guard tight ends for the life of them. We just saw what Hunter Henry and Austin Hooper did last week. Hunter even had a second touchdown that was called back because of a penalty. I have to put the green light on Lamar this week. Despite there being something obvious going on with him, the Bengals have given up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. They're the worst passing defense in the NFL. So let's give Lamar another chance and hope that he can get it done against a defense giving up the third most passing yards per game. Vegas is expecting the Ravens to score the most points of any team this week. Cross your fingers. Let's hope for the best here. Keep starting Jacoby Brissett going up against Tampa. Another 300 yards passing last week. He's now averaging 314 passing yards per game. He hasn't thrown under 258 yards in any of his 6 games. That's around what Tampa has surrendered per game as well. 6th most passing yards allowed per game. So he should be able to do his thing in this matchup. Whether Marvin Harrison Jr. is back or not, it hasn't mattered. Tampa's also given up the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks as well. They also tend to play a lot more too high safety looks than single high safety coverage, and Brissett averages almost a full yard more per drop back against too high. Fire him up as a solid QB1 this week. Let's talk Drake Maye at home against the Giants. 4 straight games now finishing outside the top 10 for Drake Maye, so you might be reconsidering with some other options. But I continue to fire him up this week against the Giants defense, giving up the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks and the 2nd most over the course of the season. More than average single high safety coverage looks means a better chance for guys like Kayshon Boutte to get open deep for a touchdown. Stefon Diggs tends to play better against that coverage as well, and Maye himself has done slightly better against single high than too high this season on a per drop back basis. Also, given the fact that they run the 2nd highest rate of man coverage, that's also in Maye's wheelhouse. He averages 7.08 yards per dropback against man coverage versus 6.5 against zone. Vegas is also expecting the Patriots to score the 4th most points this week. I'm in on Maye. Let's start Bo Nix coming out the bye, going up against Washington. Great matchup. The Commanders have allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, the 3rd most passing touchdowns per game, and the 4th most passing yards per game. It's simply one of the best matchups possible, and while Nix has been somewhat volatile this year, he's shown a very high ceiling. So it's tough to bench him in a matchup like this. Now, Washington also plays single high coverage a lot more than too high, and Nix averages 6.34 yards per dropback against single high versus only 4.94 against too high. He also tends to do better against man coverage than zone, so with Washington playing man at the 9th highest rate, another reason to like Nix. Good matchup advantage for him in this one. Now, notice I didn't have Joe Burrow in the green light. He's a yellow light quarterback for me this week. If you're wondering how I'm treating Joe Burrow coming off the injury early, by the way, he's coming off pretty early, okay? Like, I would love to start Joe Burrow, okay? And if I had him, in most cases, I probably would. But I tend to lean on some of these other guys that I just mentioned as starts before starting Burrow in his first game back. The Bengals team implied total is sitting at only 22 points right now. That's middle of the pack. I'd just rather start some of these other quarterbacks. I'll have Burrow as a low-end QB1 for this week, and, we'll move him up from there. I think he obviously can have a huge game, but the Ravens have allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. And the last time a quarterback had a good game against them was week 5 when CJ Stroud was able to throw for 4 touchdowns. Since then, they've only allowed 3 passing touchdowns since week 5. So I'm tempering expectations. Another yellow light quarterback is Baker Mayfield. I'm tempering expectations here. Mayfield might end up playing this week, but I might be looking for another option. We saw that he really aggravated that shoulder when he tried to sling it deep before halftime on Sunday night, even though it was his non-throwing shoulder. I'm a little worried about him taking a hit in this game, but also, does he have the same type of upside if he'll be somewhat limited in his movements? Now, Arizona has been solid against quarterbacks this year, but Trevor Lawrence and Brock Purdy both threw 3 touchdowns against them 2 weeks in a row. But then you look at the 3 previous weeks, weeks. Sam Darnold, Dak Prescott, and Jordan Love, they all only threw for 1 touchdown each against Arizona. So tempering expectations just a little bit. I don't love Brock Purdy this week. He's a red light quarterback for me, okay? Going into Cleveland, the weather doesn't seem ideal. He just threw 3 interceptions on Monday night. Going into Cleveland doesn't spark a lot of confidence for me. I might be looking for another option. The Browns have allowed the second fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks, the third fewest over the course of the season. They've allowed the third fewest passing yards per game as well. So with no teams on bye this week, there just might be better options out there. Let's move to some green light running backs. Let's start with TreVeyon Henderson at home against the Giants. Remember when the Bengals were the best matchup on the board for running backs? Well, Henderson didn't quite live up to those expectations last week, but the good news was that he was clearly RB1 for that matchup. Hopefully that continues. Ramondre's getting healthier. Now, we talked about it on Monday's Week 12 Takeaways podcast episode. Does that change this week? We'll see. I'm going to treat this the same way I treated it last week. Too much upside in this matchup to overthink it. I'm just going to start Henderson as a high-end RB2. The Giants are giving up the most fantasy points over the last 4 weeks, the second most over the course of the season. They've also given up the most yards per carry to running backs over the past 4 weeks and over the course of the season. And as a result, they've given up the second most rushing yards per game to running backs and the third most rushing touchdowns per game to the position as well, okay? So you're looking at the 4th highest team implied total for the week. So I got to keep him in my lineup for this one. Let's talk about the Steelers running backs going up against Buffalo at home. I think we're at the point now where we might want to start both Jaylen Warren and Kenneth Gainwell in a matchup like this one against the Bills. The Steelers use their running backs in a 1A, 1B type of situation where Warren was the primary early down back, and then Gainwell was a primary passing down back, but he still got some work in the run game too. And against the Bills at home, they've been really bad against running backs. I'm starting Warren as a RB2. I'm starting Gainwell as like an RB3 flex that has like RB1 upside that he's shown over the past couple weeks. But Buffalo's allowing the most rushing touchdowns per game to running backs, the second most yards per carry to running backs, the third most over the last 4 weeks, and the third most rushing yards per game to running backs this year as well. So with Aaron Rodgers likely back, but given that they wouldn't want to expose him to hits with that wrist injury, as well as limit him as much as they can, they will probably lean on these running backs as much as possible. Let's talk about RJ Harvey going into Washington, okay? Green light for Harvey. He didn't come through in a tough matchup against the Chiefs in his first game as the starter before his bye week, but the underlying utilization was pretty encouraging. 61% of snaps, 61% of the rushing attempts, 48% route participation. That's good enough to provide RB2 worthy consideration against the Commanders. And who knows, maybe coming out of the bye, it's even higher. Washington's given up the second most fantasy points to running backs over the last 4 weeks and the 5th most over the course of the season. They're also allowing the 5th most rushing yards per game to the position as well. Harvey will likely be more involved in the receiving game than he was in week 11. Given the target rate that he had was 15% in this game, that was considerably lower than 23% that he had coming into the game. Let's talk about Bucky Irving. I'm going to give him the green light. We've been waiting this long. Let's get him in the damn lineup. Luckily, the matchup isn't bad at all. The Bucs are at home. The Cardinals are top 10 in fantasy points allowed per game to running backs, both over the course of the season and over the last 4 weeks as well. They've also allowed the 5th most yards per carry to running backs over the last 4 weeks. This is a good matchup for Bucky to come back to and get his feet wet. Now, it's possible we don't see a full complement of snaps for Bucky in his first game back, but listen, as long as he's getting close to like 15 opportunities, which I think he'll get close to, he'll be in my lineup. Let's talk some yellow light running backs. You just picked up Devin Neal off the waiver wire going up against Miami in Miami. I'm treating him as a, borderline RB2, maybe high in RB3 this week. Relatively good matchup for running backs. I'd expect him to see most of the work in the backfield. Like we saw a lot of Taysom Hill, the goal line last week. Like he's not playing that well. So we'll see if that continues. I'd be a little bit worried about Hill's role around the goal line. But with all that being said, I think Neal should have a relatively safe floor given how much he'll likely be on the field and the expected usage in the receiving game. So he was on the field 86% of the time of snaps after Kamara left the game. He ran a route on 73% of Shug's dropbacks, 18% target share. He looked good in the receiving game. The week before, when Kamara was good, like he drew a target on 30% of his routes. So it seems like Tyler Shug is, looking for him out of the backfield. Miami's also allowing the 9th most receptions and the 6th most receiving yards to the running back position, not to mention the 4th most rushing yards per game. So I think he's a pretty decent start this week. I'm going to temper expectations on Javonte Williams, going up against Kansas City. He's been an RB1 all year long. The volume has been there. He hasn't finished higher than the RB20 since week 8 though. 2 reasons for that. One is that he hasn't scored in 3 games, but also because, since CeeDee Lamb returned to the lineup, he's only averaging 1.2 receptions per game opposed to the 3.5 that he averaged without him. And this this week, he goes up against a Chiefs defense that has limited Jonathan Taylor to 16 carries for 58 yards last week, Jahmyr Gibbs to 17 for 65 with 0 receiving yards. Still starting Williams, given the offense that he's on, but I'm tempering expectations. You might want to consider adding some upside elsewhere in your lineup. I'm also tempering expectations on Chase Brown going into Baltimore. Samaje Perine is back in practice. It looks like he could be good to go on Thursday against the Ravens. That could mean that Perine will be back in his role as the primary passing down back and 2-minute back. There's also a possibility that the Bengals just decide to continue to roll Chase Brown out on 90%-ish amount of snaps again, maybe somewhere in between, but it is worth noting that Chase Brown was sitting somewhere between 50 and 60% of snaps in the 4 weeks prior to Perine hurting his ankle. Okay, so massive difference there. It's resulted in almost 9 targets per game while Perine's been out. The hope is that Brown can continue to earn targets while running routes on early downs. And if the offense takes a step forward, we might not notice too much of a dip in the fantasy production. By the way, he hasn't scored recently either, right? So that could make up for it as well. Baltimore's also been a bit better, say that 10 times fast, against running backs lately. They've only allowed the 6th fewest fantasy points to the position over the last 4 weeks. That being said, I'm still starting Chase Brown as a borderline RB1, high-end RB2 this week until we see Perine take his job back. Just, something to keep an eye on going into this game. Let's move on to some green light wide receivers, and let's start with Khalil Shakir going into Pittsburgh. Now, this Pittsburgh team, they're giving up the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, the most receiving yards per game to wide receivers, the most receptions per game to wide receivers. So you're damn right I'm going to have Khalil Shakir in my lineup. Not only that, but he averages 2.48 yards per route run and a 27% targets per route run rate against single high safety coverage, and the Steelers run that at the 6th highest rate in the league. Oh, and in case you needed more reason, Pittsburgh's also given up the 2nd most fantasy points to slot wide receivers, okay? So I can keep going on if you want me to, but I'll stop. Green light for Khalil Shakir this week. Michael Wilson going into Tampa. Keep riding the hot hand, man. If Marvin Harrison Jr. isn't back this week, there is no way Michael Wilson should be out of your lineup after catching 10 plus passes and averaging 150 yards. He's a wide receiver 1 for me this week, okay? Now he gets Tampa Bay, who have allowed the most fantasy points to wide receivers over the last 4 games. They've allowed the 4th most receptions per game, the 6th most receiving yards per game to wide receivers. On top of all that, they've given up the 2nd most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers, in particular over the last 8 weeks and over the last 4 weeks. And that's where Wilson has run most of his routes, 85% of his routes on the outside over these last 2 weeks. He's pretty much a must start, okay? If Marvin Harrison ends up playing this week, I think Wilson's still going to be in my lineup, but obviously we'll have to downgrade him to more of a boom bust type play because we don't know what this is going to look like if Harrison is in the lineup. I'm taking my chances though. Next up is Jaylen Waddle. Green light against New Orleans. He didn't come through against Washington before the bye, but he should return to lineups against New Orleans. On the surface, you see that the Saints have been middle of the pack in terms of allowing fantasy points to wide receivers, when in fact, they've given up the 4th most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers this season, and the 5th most over the last 4 weeks. They also run single high safety coverage at the 7th highest rate in the league, and Waddle has simply been dominating one of the best wide receivers against single high safety coverage. 3.26 yards per route run against single high, compare that to 2.05 against two high, and then 32% target rate against single high, compare that to his 20% against two high. Fire him up. And on the other side, Chris Olave, starting him as well. Now on paper, Miami has been extremely stout against wide receivers, right? If you're looking at the spreadsheet, you're like, oh my goodness, they haven't allowed anything. However, if you look deeper, you'll notice that they haven't really gone against a ton of great talent. Now, if I'm working backwards from the Washington game going back, Deebo Samuel was fine in week 11 before their bye, 7 catches for 74 yards and a touchdown. Khalil Shakir was relatively fine, 7 catches for 58 yards. Zay Flowers was okay, 5 for 64, nothing, up or down from what he normally has been doing. They played Atlanta without Drake London. They played Cleveland before that. T-Mac was fine, before that, 6 for 73. Garrett Wilson before that, 6 for 82 and a touchdown. Michael Pittman before that, 6 for 80 and a touchdown. So if you were worried about the perceived matchup for Olave, I wouldn't. Let's talk about some yellow light wide receivers. Let's start with the Broncos wide receivers, okay? Courtland Sutton and Troy Franklin, they've been all over the place this year in terms of production. But this week, I think the matchup's pretty good. We talked about Bo Nix earlier. Now, we haven't seen Sutton finish as a top 24 wide receiver lately like he did 5 times in his first 7 games this season, but at least he's not a complete dud. He's at least finished in the top 36 3 times in his last 4 games. Franklin, on the other hand, he had 3 top 24 finishes in his last 4 games. Now, the Commanders, they've given up the 2nd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers over the last 4 games and the 3rd most over the course of the season. They allowed the 2nd most receiving yards to wide receivers as well. Both Sutton and Franklin, along with Bo Nix, they perform way better against single high safety coverage than two high, and the Commanders play that at the 9th highest rate in the league. By the way, don't sleep on Pat Bryant. He's been the Broncos' primary slot receiver over the last few weeks before their bye, and the Commanders have been extra generous to slot receivers this year. I don't know if he'll be in my lineup this week, but just saying. Next up is Christian Watson going up against Detroit on Thanksgiving. It's been a minute since Romeo Doubs has put up a solid fantasy outing, but Christian Watson is emerging as a result. Watson led the team with a 35% target share in a full-time role, 88% route participation this past week. He's been above 80% route participation for 3 games in a row now, 29% target share over the last 2 games compared to Doubs' 21%. This can easily go back and forth between the two, but the fact that Detroit leans heavily into single high safety looks benefits Watson. We liked him going up against the Giants a couple weeks ago. Similar situation here. He averages 2.76 yards per route run against that coverage compared to Doubs' 1.73, okay? And with Watson back, Doubs has been more of the too high safety guy in terms of where the production is coming from. Both Packers wide receivers should be trusted like wide receiver 3s this week, given the Lions have given up the 2nd most receiving touchdowns, the 8th most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers, but Watson, I think, has more upside between the two guys. Let's talk about the Jaguars wide receivers, right? Like, you got to take a gamble with these guys. They're going up against Tennessee. Now, I'd assume that Brian Thomas Jr. is back this week, which really throws a wrench into the opportunity shares between him, Jacoby Myers, and Parker Washington. But don't forget, Brenton Strange is back too. Over the last 2 games, Myers has led with a 25% target share, followed by Washington at 17%. Washington had a pretty good game this past week. The matchup against Tennessee is great for all these wide receivers this week against the Titans, man. 11th most fantasy points given up to the left perimeter. That's for BTJ. 9th most fantasy points given up to the slot wide receivers over the last 8 weeks. That's good for Parker Washington. And the 5th most fantasy points given up to the right perimeter over the last 8 weeks. That's good for Jacoby Myers. So overall, Tennessee has given up the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers this year, the 3rd most receiving yards to the position as well. So if you have any of these guys, they're all volatile wide receivers this week because we really don't know what to expect and, what the pecking order is going to end up being, because I wouldn't be surprised if it falls in any order, any permutation between these 3 wide receivers. Like, I would be like, okay, I get it. But all these guys do have upside this week. Stefon Diggs going up against the Giants. Okay, listen, I have to go back to the well with Diggs despite the down game last week against the Bengals. The Patriots just targeted the tight ends like crazy against a defense that couldn't defend them. Hunter Henry was targeted on 34% of his routes. Austin Hooper was targeted on 27% of his routes. Diggs has had games like this, man, where his route participation just drops for no reason. Or maybe that broken finger that he admitted to recently. But it happened way before week 11. So I don't know. And that big game that he had, right? So anyway, in this past game, it dropped all the way down to 54%. He just ran a route on 78% of dropbacks and 89% of dropbacks the previous 2 games. Now, will it bounce back? I don't know. But I mean, it is worth noting that Booty was out the past couple games, right? This past week, Booty returned to an 85% route participation, okay? And then Mac freaking Hollins getting 78% route participation, which is basically leaving Diggs to slot duties when they want to run 3 wide receiver sets. So, I want to have Diggs in my lineup because the Giants have given up the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers, the 5th most receiving yards to the position as well. But, he's closer to a borderline wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 for me if this type of usage continues with Booty back. And by the way, speaking of Booty, a little bit of a desperate start as well against this defense because of that single high nature that he's going up against. Now let's talk Adonai Mitchell going up against Atlanta. This is a deep, desperate start, guys. Okay, this is like the long shot of the week. Now, if you were in a PPR league, maybe John Mechie is probably a safer option here. But against an Atlanta defense that runs the most single high safety coverage in the NFL, AD Mitchell has a chance of catching one over the top for all you desperate fantasy managers out there who need a desperate home run in your lineup. Mitchell, believe it or not, he's averaged 3 yards per route run and a 35% target rate against single high safety coverage this season. He was tied for the 2nd most air yards among all wide receivers last week, and Atlanta has allowed the 7th most fantasy points to perimeter wide receivers over the last 4 and 8 weeks. So if you're looking for someone on the waiver wire, you can do worse. And there's one wide receiver. Actually, there's one player in this whole thing that I want to bench, and that's DK Metcalf. And because I chose one wide receiver to bench, of course, that one wide receiver and the one player is going to absolutely go off this week. But he suffered an ankle injury last week. He should be fine for this game. But 2 reasons why I don't love Metcalf this week. One is that Buffalo plays the 7th highest rate of 2 high safety coverage, and Metcalf has only been targeted on 16% of his routes against those looks. Compare that to 29% against single high, okay? Second, he's run more than 50% of his routes from the left perimeter this season, and Buffalo's allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to that side of the field, okay? So maybe you find another option. Maybe a couple tight ends I want to mention. Okay, first of all, green light for Mark Andrews against Cincinnati. Okay, by all means, Isaiah Likely as well. I'd imagine the Ravens want to go tight end heavy against the Bengals, just like the Patriots did this past week. And Likely has had a 50%-ish route rate over the past few weeks. His target share, 15%-ish over the last 4 weeks, can easily balloon up to like 20-25% in this particular matchup. He's like a desperate flex play, just to be clear. But back to Andrews, we saw Hunter Henry go nuts last week against the Bengals. They allow the most everything to tight ends, the most fantasy points per game over the course of the season and the last 4 weeks, the most receptions per game, the most receiving yards per game, the most receiving touchdowns per game to the tight end position. Okay, so you kind of have to start Andrews this week, even if he's a flex play. Let's start Juwan Johnson going up against Miami. He's been very involved in the passing game. Tyler Shug continues to target him as the second target behind Chris Olave. Johnson has finished as a top 12 tight end 4 weeks in a row now. He gets to face a Miami defense that's allowed the third most fantasy points per game to tight ends over the last 4 weeks and fourth most over the course of the season. They're also tied for the second most receiving touchdowns per game given up, along with the fifth most receiving yards per game given up to the position. So I think he's a solid tight end 1 this week. My full rankings for the week is available now at upperhandfantasy.com. I'll be updating that throughout the weekend. I'm over at Upper Hand Fantasy on Instagram as well. I hope you guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I'll see you guys soon.